Well, good morning, everybody. So those of you that are 4R certified facilities, you're off the hook. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about manure. So spent a lifetime in manure, worked for soil and water districts for many years, doing manure management in north central Ohio. Worked for Kevin Elder and crew at the High Department of Agriculture as an inspector for the large livestock facilities. So manure is really my background. And by the way, if you have questions during, speak up loud. Too many tractors and so forth over the years, so I may not see your hand, but I don't mind questions during. So we're going to talk about manure and the 4R's. Seen a lot of 4R presentations where they try and fit everything in precisely. Manure is a different animal, no pun intended. So I'm going to talk about, and it does fit into the 4R's, but I'm going to talk about things that I have seen with manure that really could be improved. Some of it's old hat in terms of the issues, but we got to kick things up a notch in terms of management, and then just some practices that really fit in with manure and the whole 4R / agronomic / environmental issues. So just a little overview. I don't have to go over with you. Right source, right rate, right time, right place has environmental and economic and social implications. We're all familiar with that. It's a great concept, but gets used a lot. So how do I know the nutrient value of applied manure? Manure is extremely variable. It's just unbelievable how variable it is. It'll vary by species. So a large dairy with 3 holding ponds in series that one flows to the other. The third pond, you'll have maybe a pound or 2 of ammonium per 1,000 gallons. You're lucky to get a pound of phosphate, typically a half pound, K2O, maybe 3 or 4 pounds. All the way then to the other end of the spectrum, you have poultry litter, which if it's nice and dry, can have 60, 70, 80, 90 plus pounds of phosphate per ton. So it's all over the place. It'll vary by storage type. It'll vary by depth in liquid systems. Years ago in Sandusky County, we had some extra grant money left over, just fooling around. And we had a guy applying manure out of a finishing pit, knew he wasn't going to agitate, so every foot of depth, we took a manure sample. The sludge at the bottom, the last 2 feet, were 10 times the phosphate concentration of the top. 10 times. So those of you who apply fertilizer for a living, what if with commercial fertilizer you applied, had a variance of 10 times? You'd be out of a job. But those are the challenges with manure. And I'm a huge manure fan. It does wonders for soil and agronomic systems. But there are real challenges. And then it'll vary by the area. We'll get into that when we talk a little bit later about taking a good manure sample. So a representative manure sample is a must, and the key word there is representative. That manure sample has got to represent what goes on this field. Not representative necessarily of the storage as a whole, but what did I get on this field? That's what counts. We're used to that with commercial fertilizer. Lots of times we seem to blow it off with manure. So here are the how-tos of a representative manure sample. The basic principle is you take multiple subsamples during application. So multiple subsamples, just like taking a soil test, you go, whether it's grids or whatever, or a straight soil test, but there are multiple subsamples mixed together. Avoid the very beginning and the very end of the application period. The beginning will tend to be dilute, the end will tend to be very concentrated. For liquid systems, agitate, agitate, agitate. There just is no substitute. And in some cases, depending on your equipment, depending on the storage type, it can take multiple agitation systems, which is hard to get around, or several hours, if not a day, of agitation before. That can be hard to get done, but it's worth the effort. You'll have a much, much more uniform product. For solid systems, multiple subsamples taken from different areas and depths. I have seen people on poultry litter stockpiled in the field, and they'll go out and they'll grab a handful just from the top. That is, you're better off with a book value than doing that. There's no substitute. You just have to, I mean, it's dirty and messy, good pair of boots, but you got to take different depths within the pile, different places, to get any idea of what you really have there. The other thing is to take at least one manure sample, and that 20 acres is just off the top of my head. The point is to have frequent manure samples as you're applying, so you know, again, what got on that 10 acres or that 20 acres or whatever. I wouldn't go over 20 acres, frankly, because it changes quickly. Book values only as a last resort. Better than a poorly taken manure sample, but only as a last resort. So those are the basic how-tos. You wouldn't believe how often that just doesn't get done. And you know what? That doesn't really cost money. It's not a capital investment. Manure tests are still cheap. They're 40, 45, 50 bucks, depending on what all you have done, like a soil sample. It's management. It's thinking it through and actually doing it. Which, you know, we all get busy. It's understandable, but it pays big dividends. Know your application rate. Now, I'm not going to go through all the methods. Don't have the time. Don't want to bore you. But there are several methods. The load, the weight of the load and the area covered method takes a little simple math. It works for both solid and liquid. For solid, you can also use the plastic sheet method. You just lay down a plastic sheet that's 1/1000th of an acre, several places of them in the field, and weigh what you've got on there and do the math and come up with tons per acre. And then, of course, flow meters are the best for liquid. But you got to know what you're getting on. It's basic, but you got to know. Yeah, yes, yeah.
56-inch square piece of plastic.
Thank you. Thank you.
You get a 56-inch
Yeah.
piece square plastic, and the weight of that is your tons per acre.
Yep, there's a guy that's done it. I've done it too. Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. Go back here. Oh, I'm sorry. Determining nutrients applied. So you've got a manure sample, and you've calibrated. You know what you're getting on. How do you know how many nutrients, what NPK and other nutrients are in that application? Well, there's the old-fashioned way, pounds per ton or pounds per 1,000 gallons times the application rate. That works fine for P and K, and for secondary or your calcium, sulfur, magnesium, and your micronutrients. But it does not account for the variability in available N, and Glenn hit on that. It's all over the place. Not only what becomes available, but what's still there. In other words, loss. If you're applying in the fall, what's still there next year. So it does not determine any additional nutrients needed from commercial fertilizers. So there are real limitations on doing it the old-fashioned way. A much better way. And I'm not going to, again, I don't have the time. I did a presentation here last week where we actually went through the tool. But the Ohio Department of Agriculture, Division of Livestock Environmental Permitting, for whom I used to work, a few of us inspectors a few years ago cornered one of the engineers, Patrick Bailey, and said, we need a down and dirty calculator for farmers and manure applicators to use so they can determine what they're getting on and to determine the best of their ability available N. So it is designed, and it's called the ODA Fertility Management Tool version. That's the latest version, 4.4. It is designed for farmer and custom applicator use. I would say there's probably an hour learning curve, which is not much, and probably for every field that you enter, maybe 5 minutes. It is down and dirty, quick and easy. It is simple and accurate. It integrates manure and commercial fertilizer. So there's certain boxes you enter in the information, soil test information, manure test information, application rate information. When was the manure put on? How was it put on? There are drop-down boxes. And then, and of course, the rotation and the projected yields. And then it will spit out additional commercial fertilizer that may be needed. It is a very useful tool and provides the best available end estimates short of in-season end testing. We'll talk about that in a little bit. There's no substitute for in-season end testing of some sort, but short of that, this is the best out there. It's a quick way to calculate and document, and it's available from ODA upon request. If you give me an email afterwards, I can just send it to you or get a hold of ODA DLEP, and it's not really on the website as far as I couldn't find it on their website, but it is available. It's free. It's an excellent, excellent tool. There are other tools out there. That's just my favorite. So let's switch gears a little bit. Manure in high-yield environments. Manure is, no offense to any environmental groups that might be here, but manure is the whipping boy of the environmental movement. Everybody loves to blame manure. There are some problems, of course, as there is with commercial fertilizer, but it's an unfair characterization, indictment of manure. It is unmatched for bringing dead soils back to life. I mean, soils, for instance, that maybe you just rented a farm that's been beaned for the past 20 years. There's nothing like manure to get a soil back to a good condition. Many non-irrigated corn yield winners had they was called a little manure. Usually it's a lot, but that's often used in the plots. Manure can be the missing ingredient to higher yields after, you always got to remember the big three, you all know this, after drainage, basic fertility, and basic management are in place. But to kick things up to that next level, manure can be a missing ingredient. And the other thing is many fields are still slowly losing organic matter. Even with the advent of so-called conservation tillage, we're still slowly losing organic matter unless you're in a true no-till situation and or maybe some very light tillage and regularly adding manure, especially solid manures. We're losing organic matter. And long-term, that's a problem. And manure can help maintain or even increase organic matter. Liquids takes a very long time. Solid manure is much better at that. Let's switch to cover crops and manure. Boy, that's a combination that's very powerful for soil health. I have seen rented farms that were just a mess that honestly should have taken 7, 8, 9, 10 years to get back into shape, and where the guy was very intentional about applying manure every opportunity he could without over applying nutrient-wise, and cover crops every year, especially the high biomass cover crops. Turn those farms around in 2, 3, 4 years, and these were beat up farms. It's amazing how well they work together. Getting back a little bit to the 4R's, cover crops are very good at taking up nitrate. That's an issue with manure. It's not that manure typically doesn't have nitrate in it. It's an ammonium organic N form. But we often have to apply it, as Glenn laid out very well. Just to get it done, we have to apply it the fall before. And if the soil's warm or soil warms up quickly in the spring and there's lots of wet weather, it'll convert to nitrate, and losses can be severe, which is bad agronomically, bad environmentally. But cover crops, there's been a ton of research over the past decades. They're really, really good at taking up nitrate. Soluble phosphorus, we just don't know yet. The research is unclear at this point. They'll certainly increase infiltration, certainly help increase organic matter. It's all good for the environment. But whether they're directly that good at taking up soluble P, we don't know. So I don't want to promise something that's not there that we don't know yet. The release of nitrogen from cover crops is difficult to predict. It's really tricky. It has to do with carbon to nitrogen ratio. It has to do with weather, all sorts of things. And that's from my perspective. And again, I'm talking about kicking things up a notch from what we've been doing. In-season end testing is a must for manure, in my opinion. Now, if you get the systems where Glenn's working on, where you're putting that just like side dress, then that's just like fertilizer. Those are not the situations we're talking about. We're talking about fall applied or very early spring, perhaps. The pre-sidedress nitrogen test, which is a test of soil nitrate test, corn's about yay big, has been around a long time. It can be tricky figuring out what it means, but it does give you some idea. Generally, if it's above 25 to 30 parts per million, you don't need additional N. Mid to late season soil nitrogen testing, pain in the butt. Who likes going out in corn this big or this big? But those systems work well. The Y-drop system on commercial fertilizer is one of those systems. There are others out there. But that's very valuable because it gives you an idea of how much nitrogen is available late in the season. And our hybrids now take up a higher proportion of nitrogen late than they used to. So it's even more important. And then you have the N modeling systems, Encirca, Adapt, and Y-drop. Y-drops are not N modeling systems, but those two are. They're much better than they used to be. They're still progressing. But basically, they look at radar, they look at weather records, they look at soil conditions, et cetera, and it's a nitrogen modeling system, how much loss has occurred, and how much immobile N is likely to become available. They're better than they used to be, and that's probably the future for nitrogen, but maybe not quite there yet. But we need to do something for in-season N testing when you have cover crops and manure. And again, many of you know this, but I'll just repeat it. Cover crop selection has to be suited to the rotation and the farmer's willingness to manage. The worst thing anybody can do is to just throw a cover crop out there because the neighbor did it and not manage it, and it's a disaster, and typically the guy will never try cover crops for many, many years. After wheat is ideal, but there's few wheat acres anymore. This is a common thing, but very few people do it. I mean, it's a simple thing. After soybeans or corn silage, get that cover crop in first, then apply your manure. We know, again, from Glenn's research and others, that emerged most anything. Very few plants are really intolerant of manure, unless the manure is really hot or you really flog it on. But get that cover crop in first. After corn for grain, unless somebody knows something I don't, rye is probably still the only reliable option. That's tough, especially I live north of 30. You get south of 70, it's a little easier, you got a little more time, but north of 30 or north of 224 or 6, it gets even tougher. So yeah, that's something that we do have some options. We'll talk about that. MSU Extension, and I could not find this online. I don't know, a couple dozen. I have a fact sheet here put out by MSU Extension. I looked and looked. If anybody knows where this is online, I would love for you to tell me. I cannot find it. But they did excellent research. It's on the fact sheet. They make a long story short. The questions they had were, and they were aware of the difficulty of getting cover crops established, especially in Michigan, after corn grain harvest. They said, so if we applied this at V3 or V6 corn, just spin on cover crops, which herbicides are a problem? And none of this half-rate stuff, the full rate of pre-emergent herbicide, which herbicides are likely to nail which cover crop species? Will it reduce corn yields? And will it establish? Will it work? And lo and behold, it's working. They just spin it on at V3 to V6. These were farmer plots, but there were several of them. 3 species were successfully established. The ones that successfully established reliably were annual ryegrass, which you might imagine, crimson clover, and radish. There were no corn yield reductions at all. The only place where they had a corn yield reduction where the guy, for whatever reason, decided to skimp on N anyhow. And so it was below the recommended rate of N, and they did have a corn yield reduction there. Otherwise, no corn yield reductions. And they ended up with a list of quote-unquote safe herbicides, pre-emerge. Yeah, 5 minutes, okay, for those 3 species. That's practical work. you can get that done. You can mix it with urea, side dress urea, or however you want to get it on. But that's good work, good for them. There is Penn State research on herbicide carryover to cover crops. There's the link. I have a few of the fact sheets from that. They do give the warning that this might not apply on heavy Midwest soils, so I'll be a little careful there. But they did a lot of work. Additional manure practices. You all know no application of frozen or snow-covered soils. It's legally prohibited in the Western Lake Erie Basin for manure and commercial NMP. The research is clear. You can have significant losses. And it is prohibited statewide for permitted livestock facilities, for licensed manure applicators, and the 4R certified, which I work for fertilizer dealers, is a voluntary program. But if they agree to do that, they also agree, even outside the Western Lake Erie Basin, that they're not going to apply fertilizer on frozen or still-covered fields. Drainage water control structures, and then I'll shut it down. My time's about out. I don't know of any other practice that you know, and there's been a lot of research for 20, 25 years now, where you will get a 25 to 40% reduction in nitrate and soluble P. You will get that kind of reductions with the drainage water control structures. They are not tile shutoffs. That's a big misconception. It's just at the end of harvest, when you're done with all your field work, late fall, you put enough stop logs in, you raise the water table. You choose foot below the surface, 18 inches, whatever you choose, whatever you're comfortable with. Come spring, 2-3 weeks before you think it might warm up and you might be able to plant, you take them out and it's free drainage again. It's a water table control structure. But because they hold that water back over the winter, you get those reductions in nitrate and soluble P. They only work well on relatively flat landscapes, 2% slope or so. But they work, and they don't. When they first came out, I thought for sure they'd screw up drainage systems. They do not. They do not. Cost share is often available through SWCD and or NRCS. If you're in the Western Lake Erie Basin, there's a new round of state-funded, I think it's House Bill 299 maybe. I may have that wrong. And there'll be buy-downs on these things. It makes them really affordable. What I like about them is they do not require a change in your management system. Most everything else we talk about, you got to change your management, and that's scary. If I change this, is it going to screw up yields? Is it going to screw up my system? Blah, 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 blah. They don't. All you got to do is raise the water table late fall and lower it again in spring. So I probably better stop there.